Greetings and various assorted salutations. Welcome to the lecture on the Cold War. Now this video, at least at its initial creation, was originally designed for my World History course, but I'm going to be using it in US History 3. Essentially how they diverge is after this lecture, if you're in my US History 3 course, you will go into more detail of the American take on the end of the Cold War and its importance. If you're in my World History class, you're going to look more at what happened in Eastern and Central Europe and in the world with the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. So it just kind of varies depending on which class you're in. But let's roll on through. We're going to look at why the Soviet Union declined. Additionally, we're going to look at some of the reforms that were attempted by Gorbachev. We're going to kind of describe the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, and we're going to look at briefly, very briefly, at kind of what happens to the remaining communist countries in the world, because while the Soviet Union ends, that doesn't mean that it's the end of communism, necessarily. So first up, to talk about the end of the Soviet Union, we need to talk about how it declined. And essentially, we've been talking about the Cold War in all of my classes that have this topic. And what happens is the ideology conflict between the Soviet Union and the United States, capitalism versus communism, political, social, cultural ideologies, is a continual conflict that goes from 1945 really formally all the way up through. However, the conflict was starting to detente a bit and decrease as various Soviet leaders preferred not the risk of World War III, as noted in the slide here. But essentially, the superpowers, well, they clashed over things like the division of Berlin, they clashed over Eastern Europe, Cuba, spies duking it out in Austria. What happens is there's a de-aggression in many cases. Now, this goes up and down, of course, because the Soviets, just because they're going through decreasing the risk of conflict doesn't mean it's completely going away. For example, we'll look at it more in class, but you've got the Soviets, they invade Afghanistan in an effort to protect the communists in the country of Afghanistan, because they would like to use Afghanistan as an economic, cultural, political foothold into getting into more into the Middle East. This does not go well. A very costly war. Many Soviets and historians kind of refer to it as the Soviet Union's Vietnam. Much like the America's involvement in Vietnam leads many people to be disillusioned. In the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan, you see a similar thing. What's also not essentially what happens in Afghanistan with the communists that the Soviets are trying to pop up. They control the cities, but they have to go out into the countryside and fight the different local leaderships that do not want communism, because communists being atheists and many people in Afghanistan being of the religion of Islam oppose atheism. In fact, the United States will back groups like the Taliban in an effort to combat the Soviet Union indirectly, much like the Chinese and the Soviets provided training and resources to places like Vietnam and whatnot. The other thing that we see happen is the command economy stagnates. The way the Soviet Union works, you know this key term, the command economy. Essentially what happens is, the problem with central planning is they have an idea of what they need at the central command, but that may not meet the needs necessarily beyond it. And so one of the struggles of command economy is that in many cases efficiency decreases. And in the case of the Soviet Union, this happened a lot. They would be short of one resource and in excess of another, and it was always just a real struggle to balance these things out. And this is kind of where capitalist and communist societies diverge. with their economies, whereas the capitalist one, theoretically, the individual producers and consumers are balanced out by supply and demand. The command economy has to decide what is the demand and what can we do about the supply. And so, especially towards the end of the Soviet Union, there were often shortages of things like various food supplies, and particularly a famine in the late 80s did not help. The last thing that really hurts the Soviet Union's attempts, and this wasn't intentional, but Gorbachev, the leader of the USSR, attempts to put in some reforms that just do not work the way he expected them to. But when Gorbachev comes into office, essentially he's got a host of problems. There's shortages, there's economic turmoil, as was stated before, and also they're running into a problem of deficit spending. Essentially, the Soviet Union is going into tremendous debt to try and keep up with the military spending of the United States and keep up with spending in general, and the United States is just outpacing them. But no, and so what Gorbachev tries to do is he tries to bring in some degrees of capitalism in an attempt to save the Soviet Union and the command economy. He's kind of lets go of some of the controls that the central government has. And the problem with this is not everyone was kind of ready for this. And the Soviet Union, one of the big things that the Soviet Union was big into was full employment of people. And essentially, when you remove the command economy and go by supply and demand, sometimes there's going to be shortages of a need for workers, to put it quite frankly. And so many hardline communists were not pleased with Gorbachev's reforms. But then there's some reformers who are coming out ahead because some of those factories are doing well with the shackles of central command off of them. And so you're going to see this kind of tearing apart of the Soviet Union. Now, the policies I've been referring to, the two big ones, these are the ones that everyone likes to test you on, whether you're in world history or U.S. history, is glasnost, and I'm going to apologize in advance for my Russian pronunciation, perestroika. And these two policies are what Gorbachev tries to use to fix the Soviet Union. Glasnost refers to openness, and basically this is a giving the Soviet people the freedom of press. The idea behind this, Gorbachev's goal, was to get people to give feedback to the government so that the government could use this feedback and improve. This backfires horrendously. What happens with a lot of glasnost is instead of people complaining and giving complaints for the government to fix issues, a lot of people say, well, why are you guys in charge? We don't like you. We want free elections, especially the more vocal people speaking out. And so glasnost really destroys the Soviets' clamp over ideas and the flow of information. And that really damages their ability to the Communist Party's ability to keep a grip on things. The other concept, perestroika, this is the economic one, promotes economic freedom and less command economy practices. And I've already talked a bit about this before, but what happens with perestroika is there's some entrepreneurs in the Soviet Union who they're like, I'm going to set out, I'm going to make things work, make money. And they succeed. I mean, there's a lot of Russian billionaires nowadays. They're quite infamous or famous, depending on how you look at it. But likewise, there were a lot of people who lost out because one of the advantages of the Soviet model is everyone is guaranteed something. It may not be a lot, but it is something. And perestroika put some people at a disadvantage. And there were a lot of people who weren't ready for it because you've had several generations of people not doing economic freedom, and all of a sudden you basically say, okay, you're on your own. And that's not easy. And that really spins a downward spiral, and thanks to glasnost, people complain about that more, and trust in the Soviet Union's government collapses further and further. Of course, the United States is saying, oh yeah, this is great. Gorbachev continue these reforms. We want to see a more openness. Because these things are, the United States already has these things. And the Soviet Union's plan, Gorbachev's intent was these were reforms, not nails in the coffin. But what happens, though, is this, we'll look at it in more detail in class, but the Soviet Union dissolves itself. It's put up to a vote, and the people vote to dissolve the Soviet Union. And so what we see is these various countries break off and form their own places, and the Russian-centered, Soviet-style continuation of the Russian Empire dissolves. Going into detail of how this impacts a lot of things is Eastern Europe was part of the Soviet Union. You know, we're talking places like Hungary. Let's pull up the map here. Hungary, Ukraine, Slovakia. Well, actually, it was Czechoslovakia. They separated after leaving the Soviet Union. Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. These were part of the Soviet bloc up here. And when they broke off, when the reforms, Glasnost, Perestroika were being put in, the people in those places began pushing more and more, allow other political parties to run for office, decrease the state police, decrease of the state police deploying troops. And essentially, kind of like in the case of East Germany, the East German government depended on Soviet support, Soviet military and police to maintain order. But no, and so there is a great degree of violence. A lot of ethnic tensions also come back. The Soviet Union had managed to kind of make places like the Czech Republic and Slovakia remain Czechoslovakia. But the Czechs and the Slovaks historically have not got along with each other. And so given the chance in 1995, they've split and remain separate countries to this day. And so one of the things you don't hear about as much with Eastern Europe nowadays is Eastern Europe used to be kind of a united bloc under the USSR, and that disappears with the fall of the Soviet Union. Now, to talk about what happens to communism around the globe, Soviet-styled communism declines and pretty much all but disappears. So the Soviet Union primarily had its large control, its sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. It had its control in the former Russian Empire, and that communism, it goes away. That pretty much disappears. It's voted itself out of existence. Cuba, it remains communist. However, they lose Soviet aid, and that hurts them a ton. Cuba will come to depend on Venezuela and places like China to try and continue on, because the United States does not maintain trade relations with them for the rest of the 20th century and most of the 21st century as of this recording. But there was a brief lifting of the trade restrictions, and then they were put back in. That's a 21st century topic, though. What does happen, though, is places like communist China, they watch the Soviet Union collapse. And where the Soviets were not able to transition into capitalist economy, the Chinese were able to. Essentially what happens with the Chinese is they realize they have to make some reforms to remain competitive, and they do so. Thanks to trade relations with the United States, they take over a lot of the manufacturing in the on the planet. Their GDP starts to go up in the 70s onwards. Unemployment, whatnot, becomes a different issue. But what happens is the goal of the reforms is China realized that if it will let go of some of its economic controls, they could retain the political and social controls and allow them to continue to operate. with a communist-style country. So really, Soviet-style communism goes away, but Chinese-styled communism continues on to this day. And really, that's what happens. Is practically at the end of the 20th century, the Soviet Union collapses due to economic problems, disillusionment, and when they try and reform, the reforms backfire and people begin saying, we don't want to continue this. And then they vote themselves out of existence in the USSR, and the Eastern satellite countries break off and do their own thing. But in any case, we'll go into more detail in class, depending on which class you're in. We'll focus more on different aspects of what happens next and what happens during this time period. Until later.